Welcome, everyone. We're going to start the second panel of the morning. If you would please take your seats. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for the second panel of the morning, and welcome back to those of you who were here for our earlier discussions as well. My name is Lisa Hollibaugh. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs for Columbia College, and I want to thank you for being here for this special event as we launch a year dedicated to conversations about the core curriculum, past, present, and future. The core needs three elements to succeed. It needs content full of significant works, whether they be works of literature, philosophy, art, music, science. Students who are bright and curious and questioning, and faculty who are dedicated not only to the pursuit of new knowledge, but also to the thoughtful and intentional education of undergraduates. Today I have the pleasure of conversing with 5 such faculty members whose investment in the core curriculum has motivated them to take on the very busy, very complex, very rewarding roles of faculty chairs of our 5 shared courses in the core. A faculty chair of a core course provides intellectual leadership for a group of instructors who might come from very different backgrounds and disciplines, who might represent a broad range of experience and expertise, who are at various moments of their careers, from senior faculty to advanced graduate student, and who for a good part of the time are going to be teaching material that does not fall in the realm of their own scholarship. So chairs of core courses provide to their colleagues simultaneously a source of support, a source of coherence, and a source of inspiration. So with that in mind, I'm going to forego the option of providing my own introductions of the core chairs, although I do have very nice things to say about all of them. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you so that they can also offer some of their histories with the core curriculum.
Thank you, Lisa. Is my mic on? Are we on?
Yes.
That's much better. I don't study AV equipment. I'm Noam Elcott. I am the chair of Art Humanities and associate professor in the Department of Art History and Archaeology. I'm also a member of the class of 2000, and so a product of the core curriculum. I think it is fair. Any other members of the class of 2000? Okay, great to see you all here. I think it's fair to say the reason why I'm here is quite explicitly the core curriculum. I took Art Humanities my first semester with Stephen Murray, who is just retired from the Department of Art History. His focus and life passion was Amiens Cathedral, and some of you may have experienced in virtual reality Amiens Cathedral, which we have a demo right in the back room in the faculty room, and I was part of his first ventures into digital technologies and the pedagogy of art history. That course inspired me to take a second course in art history with Rosalind Krauss, a survey of 20th century art, and from there I never looked back. So studied modern art history, went on to graduate school, and immediately came back, once again immersed in the core.
I'm David Helfand, professor of astronomy. Just began my 85th semester of teaching at Columbia. 85 sounds better than 43 years. When I arrived here in the 1970s, I was delighted to see that, unlike all the other major universities in the United States, that Columbia had not abandoned its notion that a common curriculum for all students talking together in small groups was an incredibly valuable part of education. But I must admit I was also appalled that this intellectual coat of arms of the university, as it was described in the catalog, consisted of 7 humanities courses, 0 math courses, 0 science courses, and 0 courses of any quantitative means. But being young and naive, I thought, well, that's not a problem. I'll just make up math and science courses because we have this structure now and we can do that. And 27 years later, I succeeded in helping to add 1 course to Columbia's core curriculum. So now it's 7 humanities courses and 1 science course, Frontiers of Science. And that's now celebrated its 15th anniversary, so I think it's sort of part of the core. And, and it's been a pleasure to be chair of it through much of that time.
So my name is Emmanuel Fader. I'm a professor in French and history. I arrived at Columbia in 2006 from France, and I've been teaching CC with some interruptions since then. I must say that actually it was not love at first sight. I was a little skeptical about the enterprise, mostly because I came from a tradition where I basically learned humility before great thinkers, and it felt a little crazy to teach and to understand Aristotle in like 3 sessions, right? We spent a full year on one book. So, but I grew loving teaching CC, first of all because of the fact that actually because we were challenged to go fast, in a way we were also forced to look at the most essential ideas, to extract the core of the text. Also because obviously the intensity of the pedagogical relationship with the students, and also I must say because I've learned every single session on those texts. Some of them I had read throughout a year. I've learned things from the fresh perspective of students. And I would say about being the chair of contemporary-physician, one of the things that maybe some of the students and alumni here are not aware of is that it's community building also for the faculty. So there is an incredible group of faculty of all levels who meet every week behind the scenes, sometimes with some anxiety over some text, and we discuss how to teach the text. So it's a fantastic collective enterprise.
My name is Elaine Sis Minh. I'm in the music department, chair of music humanities. I came to Columbia in 1982 and went immediately from teaching an elective course in music appreciation at the University of Michigan with 300 students to teaching the core with 24, not quite sure they wanted to be there, boys. So the following year things changed when women were admitted, but it was a remarkable education for me. My first time chairing Music Hum was in 1988, which happened to be the year of Ted DeBerry's commission on the core, which resulted in the creation of the extended core. The questions were to change the core by introducing works not within the tradition that had been to that point known, or actually to treat other traditions with the respect they deserved and enable students to take what was first called the extended core, then major cultures, and now the global core. I've chaired Music Hum many times since then, including for a big stretch of the 1990s, and I'm very excited to be doing it again.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joanna Stalnaker. I'm the chair of Literature Humanities, and I'm also a professor in the Department of French. And when I first came to Columbia in 2002, I wanted to teach the core because I needed an education. I had never taken it. I went to Swarthmore College, where we had practically no requirements, and I myself was very anti-requirement. So I remember petitioning to get out of the requirement for the French major to take an 18th century French literature and philosophy course, which is now the area of my research specialization. So I'm lucky that I eventually found 18th century, the Enlightenment, later on in my life. So I came to Columbia to teach literature, but I had read all of 3 works on the Lit Hum syllabus: Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Michel de Montaigne's essays. So when I say to students in that classroom, no one is an expert here, and we're all here to learn together, I really mean it, and I tell them how little I knew about this tradition and this core, incredibly enough, even as a professor of literature, when I came here. So my entire perspective on required courses and Western literary canons has changed over the 20 years that I've been teaching here.
Thank you all. I'm now going to pose some questions to our panelists. We're going to alternate who answers the questions, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. I'd first like to pick up on something that you said, Elaine, about the difference between teaching a large course at another institution and moving into the core. Most colleges and universities have a general education requirement that requires students to choose courses from departmental offerings, often introductory courses in a discipline. So how does the core curriculum take a different approach? For example, what is different from in music humanities to a large introduction to music class, or I could pose the same question and will to David, what makes Frontiers of Science distinct from an introductory course in a science, and Noam, what makes art humanities different from an introductory art survey? So Elaine, could you start us?
To an extent, it's not just the difference between an elective or required course or the difference between a large lecture and a small class, but of course much of it does have to do with the shape and size of the core. In fact, when you teach great works of music to a willing audience, you're demonstrating them, you're showing them, you're explaining, and students can take it in, and many people will change their lives based on their experience of beauty and sublimity or terror and fear in the music that they study. But when you have an engaged class of 24 or 25 students with whom you're actually looking not only at the music as primary texts, but the primary texts of the era in which it was written. When we study Gregorian chant and the chants of Hildegard of Bingen from the perspective of St. Augustine's idea of the enduring problem of music for religious ritual and prayer and music, the pleasure that music brings. This is a knotty issue that many of our students actually are dealing with in their own lives. So that the function of engaging with students, one of the biggest issues we know is that you don't know what students can hear. And I don't mean can hear, I mean, what does anyone hear? Hear that melody or hear that bassoon? I've had students say, I didn't know how to listen before I took this course. And I can trace a chain of musical thought now. So that it's not that in an elective course or in an introductory course or in a music appreciation or history course, students don't have good experiences. But I don't get to see the minds of the students grappling with what they hear, and the class as a whole doesn't get to go through the process of engaging with works that they hear.
Yeah, I think a singular difference in Frontiers and a typical introductory science course here at Columbia or elsewhere is that we're freed from the tyranny of content. All students take Frontiers of Science in their first year, and yet no subsequent course depends crucially on a body of knowledge or a set of facts. And so it allows us to liberate the idea that science is a set of facts to be memorized and equations to be solved, and to explore it as it is, a highly social enterprise designed to create falsifiable and predictive models about the way the world works, and then to test those models and to always leave nature as the arbiter. I guess the other thing in its context in the rest of the core, most of the core is about the celebration of remarkable individual human creativity. We try to give them a little perspective on this. First, we hit them with the astonishing hypothesis that your hopes and dreams, your memories and experiences, your delusion of free will is just the workings of 100 billion neurons and the chemicals that interact with them. And then we point out that their species, Homo sapiens, is one of several million species that currently exist on this planet, having evolved from bacteria a couple billion years ago. And it's on this one planet out of 8 orbiting this extraordinarily ordinary star, which is one of 100 billion stars in our tiny little island called the Milky Way, which is distinguished by the other 100 billion galaxies in that it's got a name, the Milky Way. And this, after a few weeks, has them a little bit more humble and perhaps more open to what you have to teach them.
I'm going to zoom in just a tiny bit from the cosmos and provide, but really in full agreement with what Elaine and David have already said, and provide one example of how ArtHum differs from a survey. A survey which is, a good art history survey does just that. It surveys the history of art from Olympian heights over huge expanses of time and space. ArtHum touches down on just maybe 12 episodes, sometimes focusing even on a single monument over the course of a semester. So exhaustion is not even, exhaustive survey is not even a question. Instead, we dig down deep with a double focus. The first is, what does it mean to see the world through the eyes of a different time and space, through a different culture? What would it mean to see the world as if you were a Greek? And the second is, doing the same process in reverse. What does it mean to interrogate our own vision and to think about our own vision in relationship to this much longer history of vision? How does art and art history play a role? Okay, very abstract. What does that mean in practice? Well, the very first assignment we give students now, and to be rolled out more extensively come fall 2020, we ask them, I should ask, how many people here have taken art humanities? Whoa. Fantastic, fantastic. How many people here have been to the Acropolis in Athens? Brilliant. How many people have spent time in Morningside Park? Okay, we're ready to go. We send students into Morningside Park. When I was an undergrad, you didn't actually do that very much. So I was glad to see a lot of hands go up. I should have asked how many people spent time in Morningside Park while in Columbia College, and I suspect there would be far fewer. But we send students into Morningside Park and have them make their way up to Alma Mater. So just literally, I can see Alma Mater through the glass doors to the very steps that are in front of Low Library. And they take that trek from up the steps. First, actually, they confront this huge retaining wall, the Morningside, that separates Harlem from Morningside Heights, or more precisely, separates Morningside Heights from Harlem. They make their way up through this through the gates, often policed, through this constricted space, and then it opens up onto the campus. And in that open campus, we immediately recognize symmetries. And we also almost involuntarily continue our ascent, and eventually we arrive before a statue, Alma Mater, which is conspicuously modeled after Athena. This is almost exactly the same walk that Athenians would have taken. Now, I take this walk every day. I take from my house in Harlem to my office in Schermerhorn Hall, I take this walk basically every day. In ancient Athens, people would have taken this walk up the ramp. It wasn't steps back then, it was a ramp. Up the ramp to a gate called the Propylaea, and you enter through the Propylaea, squeezed again, just like your entrance to campus, and it opens up. And in your opening up, you see this incredible temple, the Parthenon, and you can continue your ascent upwards. You arrive around the back, and what do you see? This huge statue of Athena. Once a year, the Athenians and all Pan-Athenaic, so all the Greeks, would come in a procession that would go from Athens up this ramp, all the way through the Propylaea, all the way around the back of the Parthenon, and worship Athens. Once a year, Columbia undergraduates and faculty, joined by alumni and families, wear official regalia, and they walk or process to commencement before our own statue of Athena, Alma Mater, and perform the academic rite. The Pan-Athenaic procession and Columbia procession are in fact very much in dialogue. The dialogue, though, doesn't end there, because as everyone knows, there's a hierarchy established by that retaining wall that separates Morningside Heights from Harlem. Did I mention Acropolis? Acropolis in Greek is Acropolis, the city on the heights. So Morningside Heights and the Acropolis, the city on the heights, have many things in common. And it's including of who gets to be in and who gets to be out. So Harlem represented one class of people, often one skin tone of people. Columbia represented another one. Inside these sacred walls, which are guarded and almost fortress-like, especially running down Amsterdam, we had, for most of its existence, wealthy white men. Just like citizenship in ancient Greece was reserved for wealthy white men. And this is not something that you just read about in the history books or have to check off in some political correct box. This is built into the very architecture, urban planning, and styles of Columbia University. What ArtHum does is not provide some type of grand survey over the whole history of art. It provides students with the critical skills and ideally the passion to recognize that we are walking in the steps of the ancients, we are borrowing and reviving their forms, but we also carry on their burdens. We also have to finish the work, the democratizing ethical work that was left unfinished. And we do this all not through words, but through images, through our bodies, through our sensual aesthetic experience.
My next question is for Joanna and Emmanuelle. You both mentioned your own skepticism when first encountering the core. Our students are intent on preparing themselves to succeed in a contemporary world, and they sometimes question how a work from a time or a culture or a world that is very distant from their own will help equip them for that success. So could you talk about how core faculty guide students to find in the content of the core ideas and attitudes and questions that speak to their current lived experience? And Joanna, would you start?
Yeah, so when I speak to students about the LitHum, whether it be in the LitHum classroom or now, I have the opportunity to speak to many more students about LitHum in my role as chair. I often talk with them about the lure and the dangers of presentism, by which I mean the illusion that we don't need the works of the past or the thinking of the past in order to grapple with the problems of the present and the future. But I think that and those are interesting conversations, and those are conversations we have in the LitHum classroom all the time, but I also think that we need to think hard about how to make that argument effectively to students in today's world. So one thing that we are experimenting with this year in LitHum is we've introduced something we're calling a contemporary core work into the syllabus. So the idea of a contemporary core work is something that a work that explicitly engages with the material that is already on the syllabus, and usually with a work that would be from the distant past. It's also a work that speaks directly to issues that we are grappling with and facing, urgent issues that we and our students are grappling with and facing in today's world. And finally, Sheena Wright spoke this morning about some of the exclusions that have been perpetuated by the LitHum syllabus or by canons in general, the idea of a Western canon. And so we're looking in this contemporary core work for works from voices or perspectives that have traditionally been marginalized or excluded from that canon as a way of opening out that canon. And that work of opening out canons is always going on. I think it's important work. So the work that we've selected for this year is a trilogy, a dramatic trilogy by a young African-American playwright named Susan Laurie Parks. It's called Father Comes Home from the Wars. And it's a rendition of the Odyssey, of Homer's Odyssey, set during the American Civil War. So, I think it's interesting for students to, in reading a work like this, and we're also inviting Parks to campus, so we can't bring Homer to campus, but we can bring Parks and ask her, and students will be talking about, why did she feel compelled to turn to Homer's Odyssey and also to Aeschylus's Oresteia in writing this trilogy? Why those works, and then of course there are other sources that were important to her, but why are those the explicit sources that she's engaging with in order to grapple with questions of slavery and the historical legacy of slavery in terms of the racist violence that we're seeing in our society today? And I think that is a way of making the argument that we still need to read the works of the past, but that we also need to push against the exclusions and the barriers of Western canons as they have been presented to students at Columbia and as they are presented more broadly to people out in the world. So that's just one example, but I think that is sort of part of the work of bringing the present into dialogue with the past in innovative ways, in ways that sort of preserve the syllabus and also push against some of its borders.
Emmanuelle?
Actually, I think there are at least three ways of thinking about this in the context of CC. One is that if you want to succeed in the world, you have to understand where it comes from, how it came to be. So our ideas, our values don't come from thin air. They have a long, complex history, sometimes a twisted history. There are some breaks, but we have to understand this history in order to understand where we stand now, right? So the work we do in CC to a large extent is that of a genealogist. We start with who we are now, and you try to understand the different lineages that have made us who we are. So there are some great uncles that we don't really want to see sometimes that we have to bring back in the story, and we do that. The other way of thinking about the distance sometimes between the the syllabus that is heavily planted toward the classics is that it's actually this distance itself that is helpful to understand who we are now. I was actually very moved by Lilu's comment about democracy, right? He arrived at Columbia, and what does he have to deal with in his first classes, right? Plato's critique of democracy. And that actually goes on with Aristotle's critique of democracy, right? And I think that's a fantastic way, right? This distance between what these people had to think about democracy and our spontaneous, acceptance of democracy is really useful to understand why we want democracy and how what are we going to do today to keep it going. And Plato offers us, conditions, right? So he says he doesn't like democracy. He actually says it's one step removed from tyranny, right? Because what he has in mind is there are conditions for democracy to work well. One is a common, robust system of education. And more importantly, is a collective project. If you don't have that, democracy gets into tyranny. Another example that all the students, the sophomore class has been struggling with this week, is the week of Aristotle this week, is natural slavery, right? This is a concept that will have enormous importance in American history to justify slavery. And our students obviously struggle with that. They find it obviously abhorrent, right? And so one of the work we do in CC is try to understand why can't Aristotle find this abhorrent as we do, right? Why can't he see the immorality of this enterprise? And what does that tell us, right? This concept of natural slavery, what does that tell us about his conception of nature, but also our conception of human nature? How can we understand maybe that, in our vision of what nature is or human nature is, maybe there is something that would be seen as aberrant by, someone else 200 years from now, or rather 2,400 years from now. And I think the last way of, thinking about the distant past is that the distant past changes, right? The past changes with our current preoccupations. So the list of texts on CC has been changing regularly. We could do a history. There is the gallery there that shows some of this history. But for example, very recently, a year and a half ago, we introduced text by Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. We introduced ideas from a Nazi thinker, Carl Schmitt, as a way of thinking where does this thought can lead us. We also introduced text on gender and race in liberal thought, and to try to see the limits and also the great input of liberal thought to think about difference. That's my 3 ways of thinking about that.
If I could build on that in a different kind of question, we've talked about how an exploration of the past gives us knowledge and critical tools with which to analyze the present. What if we flip that? How does the present give us knowledge and critical tools with which to analyze the past, which I think you were starting, but could I ask Noam and Joanna to address that question?
So I'd offer 2 essential ways that the present is inflecting our teaching of art humanities and the whole visual past. The first is, Art Hum was founded in the 40s. It was a course by white men, for white men. That's no longer tenable. We're now embarking on the most significant curricular reform in the history of Art Hum. And it doesn't just add women and people of color to the syllabus, which it does, but it also lets us ask new questions. Questions that for men, women, people of all kinds and shapes and colors are the pressing questions for them, for their lives, for our times. So it's not merely adding some new people, but it's adding a whole set of questions and visual skills that previously were excluded because we excluded whole classes and types of people. So that's one. The second is when we think about, if I can take the question quite literally, and what are the tools of the present that shape the past, there's a classic insight from the history, theory, anthropology of technology that more than we shape tools, our tools shape us. And most of the time, this happens invisibly. We don't even realize it. At moments of great technological change, we suddenly become aware. Who isn't aware of how smartphones have changed them as human beings? In the history of art, or I should say, in literature, humanities, and CC, there are absolutely technological changes that have happened. Homer didn't write in the book format. He didn't write at all. But reading books is not a dramatic cultural, technological change. In music humanities, we listen to music, not live most of the time, it's recordings, but again, there's not perhaps as fundamental a difference. Art history is more complicated. In art humanities, the artist Chuck Close liked to joke that the history of art as taught in universities should really be called the history of slides. Because nobody looks at artworks, we just look at slides. And that's the tool of the trade. That's the present tool, for better and for worse, with which we access the past. Now, in Art Hum, we try to go to museums, we try to go to St. John the Divine to see churches, we go to see things on campus, we get people out to see the real thing, but overwhelmingly we're in the classroom and forced to rely on these things like slides. When Art Hum was founded, slides were glass and they were black and white. So you could get a very strong sense of the linear design of Raphael, just as it was incredibly useful for decomposing, say, the plan of a cathedral. But it was surprisingly, or not surprisingly, less useful for understanding or experiencing the divine revelatory blues of the stained glass windows in Amiens Cathedral and the bright bursts of red in Monet's Fields of Poppies were just gray smudges. Along comes Kodak and color film and the carousel that most of us probably remember from our youth. That introduced color. Whole new questions could be asked, experiences could be had. But still, when discussing architecture, we're reduced to a few plans, elevations, and sections, and a couple of photographs in sequence that would try to and largely fail to cohere into some type of actual human experience of architecture. Today, as many of you might have experienced right behind us in the faculty room, we're introducing virtual reality to art humanities. And it sounds like a gimmick, but until you've tried it, you can't imagine how effective it is pedagogically. You put on these headsets, and suddenly you can look 360 degrees and feel yourself as if immersed in the space. I think it's going to open up new horizons for the study of art and art humanities. But what we'll also do, because we're not getting rid of slides, we've digitized them, but they're effectively the same thing, it is give students an opportunity to realize that technology shapes their view of the world and their view of the past in the most literal sense possible. The same image captured in a black and white glass lantern slide, captured in a 35mm glass film transparency, celluloid transparency, and captured in a virtual reality headset is not the same image. It's not the same work, it's not the same experience. Not only do we shape our tools shape us, and that's one of the things that art humanities is uniquely well equipped to teach.
Joanna. Yeah, so I'd like to answer this question by speaking a little bit about two events that we planned for students of literature humanities, both last spring and just last night, actually. The first one, both of which involved women translators of classical works. So the first event was a conversation about translating sexual violence in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was a conversation between Gia Tolentino, who writes for The New Yorker, wonderful essays, and has recently published a book of those essays, and a young classicist, Stephanie McCarter, who is doing a new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, really focusing in on the question of how rape and sexual violence has been translated, or rather mistranslated, in the past, and her efforts to sort of translate Ovid better in order to better understand Ovid. And we organized this event in part because Ovid has been very controversial on the Lit Hum syllabus because it does have these stark representations of sexual violence, and students are sometimes uncomfortable with that and uncomfortable with the experience of being compelled to talk about those issues in the classroom, issues that may be very personal for them based on their own experiences. And rather than sort of shying away from that problem, the approach that we took in organizing this dialogue was to really use this as an occasion to look more closely at the text itself. And what Stephanie McCarter showed in that conversation was that previous translators of Ovid, who happened to be men, had often mistranslated in order to efface the level of sexual violence. So there's a lot of rape in that work, but actually there are instances where a translator would say she dropped her arms and gave herself to the sun god, and actually in the Latin the word is force, and it's very explicit. And so, this is kind of interesting for students to think about the fact that we can read Ovid better because of the Me Too era and all of the conversations that have come out of it, and also that we need Ovid because he really reflected on issues of power rape, violence, and how those things are connected in society. And that was part of what he was doing in this poem, was to grapple with those issues. And I was struck by the fact that students responded very positively to the event itself, but I also heard back from a lot of instructors that the classroom discussions were very rich. And I think instead of sort of avoiding certain topics, to really take them on and give them their due, and also give due to those students who have had experiences that may make those conversations difficult in the classroom, and to make room for them to be warned about what those conversations are going to entail. And I'll just give very quickly a second short example. Last night we were lucky enough to have Emily Wilson, the translator of a bold new translation of the Odyssey that just came out in 2017. And just this week she was named a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, and so it was a wonderful moment of serendipity. She came and talked at Miller Theater last night, and I know some of you were there. We had a number of alums who signed up to be there, many students, many instructors. It was a really great event. And she also talked about the complex question of her writing in today's world as a woman translator, not wanting to be limited to the tag of only a woman translator. The press has kind of presented her that way, and she pushed back against that. But she also showed us the ways that she translated certain passages differently, relating to questions of slavery in Homer's world, and relating to questions of sexual violence and violence against slave women in the poem. She translated it differently because of her own ethical and political commitments in today's world. And she has sometimes been criticized for perhaps mistranslating because of her ethical and political commitments. But she really described to us last night how, in fact, she's translating better because of those commitments. And I was, just also struck by the students were waiting outside for her to get their book signed. She had groupies, and some of them said to her, I've never met an author like you before. I mean, you're such an inspiration. This is someone who, this is a classicist who translates ancient Greek, and they are so excited about that. So that was just really wonderful to see.
Elaine?
Could I add something based on what you both have said, having to do with technology and also about relating works of the past to the lens of the present? We have no idea how much of the music of the past actually sounded. And so it's not just a question of technology and recordings bringing out these pieces, but entirely new ways of conceiving how the pieces might have sounded. And there are two ways in which this might come up. One is staging of opera. We have some idea of how an opera was staged and what it might have meant in its own time. But recently, a small opera company came to New York and presented what were immediately seen as a Me Too Don Giovanni and Black Lives Matter Fidelio, with the voices of incarcerated African Americans actually brought in to join the prisoners' chorus in Beethoven's Fidelio as people who'd been locked up without even the chance to see the sun were brought out into the open for the first time. Or, to my mind, more problematic, Mozart opera, which ended up having Don Giovanni electrocuted in a state mental institution for his violating the norms of sexual conduct against women. These are ways in which one can take canonic works that we would study in music humanities, and connect them signally to the present. Just last night, I asked my students to send me, if possible, YouTube clips that so I can see what they're listening to. And someone sent, you might be interested in DJ Tiesso's Adagio for strings. And I listen to it, and the first thing I hear is boop, 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 boop. And then I hear the Barber Adagio for strings. Now, the Barber Adagio for strings is one of the most profoundly mournful works of the 20th century. It was played when FDR died. It was played after JFK was assassinated. It was played after 9/11. It is some of the saddest music you'll ever hear. But nobody of the 92.5 million views on YouTube are experienced, and most of the courses do not have 92.5 million views in our works. They're not experiencing the Barber Adagio in any way like this. So it has been turned into something profoundly joyous, I would say. Well, depending on how you feel about boom, 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 it can be seen as possibly threatening, but the ecstatic crowd didn't look threatened by it. It looked like they were finding a way to turn a seriously mournful work through technology, beats, and a DJ into something entirely different.
David and Emmanuelle, what are some of your favorite moments from teaching the core? What are some debates that have really inspired your students? What are ways in which you've seen them have that aha moment about something about their own lived experience, what it means to be human?
I think my favorite moment each semester is when we're doing Einstein's theory of relativity, and I demonstrate to the students in an inescapable way how that if they allow signals to travel faster than the speed of light, which most of them are perfectly happy to do, that window would break before the child that threw the rock through it was born. They have a lot of trouble with this. On a more immediate level, we also demonstrate how every creature on this planet, from a paramecium to a mosquito to an elephant, uses exactly 1.0 times its metabolic energy rate, except for one species, us, which actually uses 100 times our metabolic energy rates. And so it's sort of unsurprising. It's as though each of us has 100 serfs, as Richard Alley says, and those 100 serfs produce a lot of waste. And this, of course, is the problem that we face. Whether we have debates about gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9 or the ethics of studying patients who have had strokes or tumors or diseases that have lesions on their brains to advance the science of neuroscience, or what the paths forward potentially are to avoid a climate catastrophe, we demonstrate to the students in a visceral way that these habits of mind that we're cultivating and inculcating in them, the way scientists look at the world, are an essential set of habits to have as they go forward in the world that they will inherit.
Actually, it's a difficult question, right? It's like so many great moments. It's like having to choose your favorite child almost. I must say that in general, the great moments in the context of CC are those moments when you have a very heated debate that doesn't end up in resolution, like ends up in disagreement. Everybody in the room disagrees, or there's several people who disagree, several camps, let's say, and everybody in the room agrees to disagree. And more than that, is happy to disagree, satisfied. There is a sense that, a recognition that we're there together and we grow together through a process of opposition with the text, but also with each other. And that's really wonderful. But if I have to choose one moment, I would say it's a moment that happened a few years ago with a young student, extremely brilliant, a chemist major who ended up being the valedictorian 2 years later. And he had some kind of epiphany. He was from New Jersey. He had an epiphany reading Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And he came to class and he said, I've been in prison all my life. High school, Columbia is a prison. And he was referring there to the concept that you have in Discipline and Punish of a carceral archipelago. So the idea that, in modern times, institutions of powers have worked as disciplining institutions from the army, the schools, and the prison. And of course, there was a few skeptical students were saying, really? How do you dare comparing your situation to, people who are really incarcerated in prisons, right? And that led to a fantastic discussions, not only on what Foucault really meant, but also on what life at Columbia was. And for me, this is really exemplary of what we do. We engage seriously with the text, and we use this engagement in order to reflect on our life, our everyday lives. Another thing I must say is that some of the great moments as a CC teacher do not happen in the CC class. Some of them happen in office hours, but more importantly, they happen in other classes. So what is absolutely wonderful, exhilarating, I must say, is to see your students that you didn't really, taught in your CC class, right? But you teach them in other classes, and they bring to bear all their knowledge, all their reflection from CC to the reading of other texts. So I teach regularly a class for CSER, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, called Colonization/Decolonization. It's basically a history of colonial situations since Emperor Augustus. And I see my students incredibly active and reflected in this class because they actually have the tools to understand all these texts that have promoted or criticized colonization and slavery. And there was one specific moment in one of those classes. There was we read a feminist text, a Chinese feminist text from 1907, a feminist manifesto by he, his, then. And there was a student who said, but she's responding to Mill. That's a discussion with Mill. And like the entire class said, yeah, we can understand this text so much better, right? And so they see how the ideas that they deal with in CC have spread, and have been confronted very seriously in other regions of the world at other moments. And that's actually also extremely satisfying as a professor.
My last question is for all of you. As the current chairs of these courses, you spend a lot of time thinking about the education of our undergraduates. So I'm asking a very big question here. What do you want our students to take away from the experience of the core? What do you want our students to be able to do because they've taken the core? So it's a very large question in 1 minute from each of you. Which of the, we'll go in, yeah.
If I had to boil it down to two things, it would be these. First, I want all Art Hum students to be more comfortable and hopefully more passionate about art, monuments, architecture, in ways that they would not have been otherwise. At the same time, I want them to be more critical, interrogate the visual world around them. So it sounds like a paradox, but it's not. I want them to be more engaged for the highs, but also more engaged for the lows. If they can do both of those things, not necessarily even at once, if they can do both of those things, Art Hum has been a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, I can answer that easily with a single anecdote, which I repeat in my introductory lecture for every semester of Frontiers of Science. 4 years ago, I got an email, and it began, "Hi, Professor Helfand, you probably don't remember me, but I took Frontiers of Science 10 years ago, and now I'm an editor at the Washington Post. And I don't know if you know this, but like an hour ago, United Airlines had to shut down their entire worldwide fleet because of a massive computer failure. And about half an hour after that, the New York Stock Exchange went down because their computers failed. And everybody assumed there was some attack, and everybody was running around trying to figure out what was going on. But I remembered you taught us that rare things can happen all the time, and when they happen together, they're just coincidences, and they don't need an explanation. Will you write a piece on this for the Sunday paper?" And I thought, yes, that person learned something in Frontiers of Science.
So I suppose I also would like students to do two things. First of all, I'd like them to use the ideas they've learned in CC or they've discussed in CC as tools, concrete tools in their lives. We speak a lot about morality, right? We spend sometimes excruciating hours on Kant's morality. So I'm not expecting my students, a year or 5 years from then to be able to recite the different forms of the categorical imperative. I think very few here, I don't know if Pat Kitcher is still here, but very few people here could do that, right? But the point is not there. The point is that Kant tells us something about how we should think about doing the right thing. And doing the right thing has to do with the possibility of wanting other people to do, everybody else to do that, with the possibility of telling yourself, I'm not going to make an exception for myself right now, right? So really concrete tools to think about your life. And another thing I'd like my students to do is to continue asking questions, not to think that this is about answers. In CC, we ask questions constantly. We don't feel like we need to come with definitive answers, but the point is to ask better questions, more pointed questions, more robust questions, right? So if they can go in life with that, and also with the very important idea that they do that, you can ask these questions only in a village, in a community, the community of the classroom that lasts only for 1 year, the community of your college experience, the community of alumni, and also hopefully other communities they're going to be part of throughout their lives, and think that asking questions together is what they got from CC.
The world is a polyphonic and multivalent place, and some of the qualities and understanding of listening will help students, and those are tools that they can get in music humanities. But music humanities does not just study works as transparent windows onto the polyphonic and multivalent world. It enables us to have experiences of beauty and terror, and to look at intellectual process as well as shocking results. So my students are always amazed to see the logical process of thought in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that goes from the first first four notes into chains of relation and connection, so that we understand where a single note comes from. And yet to read in a contemporaneous review that Beethoven opens to us the world of the monstrous and the immeasurable. And you think, well, how did we get to the monstrous and immeasurable if we're following the chain of his mind? And so those are connections that I think the course can enable students to grapple with. But I want to leave them with the idea that some of the profoundest thoughts ever held by human beings have been expressed in musical form.
So my answer to this question is probably partly affected by the fact that I now have a 15-year-old who's in a high-pressure high school in New York City. So I'm starting, and I work with first-year students as an instructor of LitHum, and now as chair. So I'm starting to see them through the eyes of the experiences that my son has been having as he moves towards 18. And I love Columbia students. I learn from them every day. But I find them to be, in today's world, because of the way that they have, of course, they've all had very different educations, but in today's world, many of them have been pushed to perform, to go through a lot of hoops, to perform at a very high level in various ways. I don't think that they are always necessarily taught to grapple deeply with and think sensitively about linguistic complexity, the kind of thing that Gareth Williams was speaking about this morning, political and moral complexity, gray areas, and also to listen. I'm not sure they've always been taught to listen closely to both a literary text and to themselves and each other. And so the one thing, I guess, in addition to critical thought that I want them to get out of LitHum is I want them to learn how to listen very closely in a literary text to what is different from their own preconceived notions and their own experiences, and adopt other points of view. Sort of like when you learn a foreign language, you know, that you have a decentered perspective because you've read a work of the past, because you've read a work of great linguistic and formal complexity. And also that they learn to listen closely to each other in the classroom, and that they be ready to be generous listeners, even though they all come from different places and they all have different points of view, and that's a good thing, but that they can both debate and fight back and push back and also listen and be generous to each other. So if they can get something of that through LitHum, I think that's one of the things literature teaches us, then I feel we will have done a job that's important.
I've had the pleasure of posing these questions, and some of you may have questions as well, and I think we have time for a few. We have some wonderful people who are ready to run to you with a microphone if you have a question that you'd like to pose to our chairs. There's a gentleman here in the middle. I'm sorry, I'm going to be pointing. I hope that's not rude.
When dealing with disturbing material, as the Ovid was given as an example, the concept of trigger warnings, which was not known to us, you read what was there to read and addressed it, and sensitivities to it were not particularly recognized.
Yeah.
How is that being dealt with? Is it being dealt with? Is it a situation that you think about?
Yes, it's a good question. You know, when I first came to Columbia, I teach the 18th century French literature, as I mentioned, and as many of you know, there's an author named the Marquis de Sade, from which the word sadism comes, who writes pornographic dialogues and, you know, very philosophical, very radical politically in some ways, also extremely obscene. And I waltzed into one of my French literature courses and, you know, handed this book to my students because I think it's interesting and important to read. No warning about the horrible misogynist violence that takes place in the particular book, which is The Philosophy in the Boudoir. I would not do that now. I've learned a lot. I think it's important to teach difficult and disturbing works because they force us to grapple with difficult and disturbing problems. Literature is about real life, and real life involves violence and subjugation and, you know, oppression of all kinds, and so does literature. So I would say it's important to think about who the people are in a classroom and how their different experiences may cause certain kinds of material to be very much directly disturbing and even psychologically triggering for them, and not to ever forget that. So, you know, what I do in my own teaching now, and in part as chair of LitHum, is I encourage the instructors that I work with to let their students know about what's coming so that they can be prepared and that they can make decisions about how they want to deal with certain kinds of material in the classroom. On the other hand, we can't guess what will be disturbing to students. You know, everyone has a different experience, and you know, what I assume may be disturbing to you may be very different, and I've had that experience in the classroom as well. So I think on the one hand, it's important to sort of not be too rigid against trigger warnings, to sort of give students some heads up about what the material is going to look like so that they can make decisions. And at the same time, be ready to react in the moment if you didn't do that work because you didn't foresee a way that a text was going to be difficult.
There's a young woman in the middle here in the white.
One conversation that comes up a lot in our core classes is about the classicism, sometimes of the classics, and how highbrow intellectual knowledge can be quite exclusive. So as a board, how do you make this material as accessible to all students, and how do you make this knowledge as relevant and meaningful to people of all educational backgrounds, as you've discussed?
So we recognize this. We recognize that people come from many different backgrounds, you know, in terms of education, but also in terms of culture, ethnic backgrounds, and so on and so forth. This is, you know, the whole value of pedagogy. We think long and hard collectively on how we can teach these texts best, right? So we give context, and we go slow. Right? We go slow together through this text. And I think part of what CC does, and the other core courses do too, is really actually leveling the field. Really, when you start at Columbia, people come from all different, you know, horizons. They have very, very different backgrounds and abilities to teach text. Some of them have, you know, already a lot of training coming from, you know, private schools, for example, elite private schools. And some of us have absolutely not. And what you see in the course of the year in CC, it's remarkable. It's people coming together. They accumulate, you know, educational capital, not only in terms of, you know, learning about the text, mastering the ideas, but also in terms of reading the text, arguing together. So really, one of the main, I think, value of CC is to be an equalizer between people.
One thing that we find in music humanities is that beginning with the Middle Ages puts all students on a level playing field because no one knows the music of the Middle Ages. And the idea that you once had piano lessons or something doesn't seem to come into play. But we also talk sometimes about the historical reception of the works that we've studied, so we can put ourselves into the picture as part of a musical public today. And what that might mean is looking at, for example, a man named Lin Shutang, who in 1906 was looking for cultural models for China. And he discovered Beethoven, and in fact, Beethoven was consciously imported into China at that point, and because in his own life, he was a model of struggle against disability and moral resistance and heroism, and it turned into a major, I mean, then over the course of the 20th century, Beethoven became sometimes more bourgeois, sometimes less bourgeois, but he nonetheless became a kind of important exemplar. And so recognizing that some of what we teach has different valences all over the world is sometimes useful.
We have somebody back there.
Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, so as we're celebrating the 100 years of the core, there's always this question of like, how can we modernize or bring the core to be more inclusive of all voices, piggybacking to the other question. So for me, the question is that, is there a possibility that the core might be way more archaic as we go for the next 100 years? And if so, what are the ways of how can we be more inclusive and modernize in a way that is not only accessible, but also talks to voices and challenges as we see in the next 100 years, whether that is technologically, ideologically, politically, et cetera?
I could answer, but I don't think it would be relevant.
I mean, I think I mean, I guess I've already talked a little bit about my thoughts about that kind of question, but you know, some of the experiences that I've had recently with, you know, questions of current translators of classical works, you know, but also the fact that fragments of Sappho's poetry are still being discovered, you know, as recently as 3 years ago. So the work of engaging with these texts in very exciting ways and in inclusive ways, in ways that bring new voices to the conversation about classical literature is happening right now. And I find that students can get very excited about that, that it not be a sort of either-or question. It's not either we keep just the traditional core and we sort of cling to that, or we modernize it completely because we assume that it will be irrelevant. To me, there's a sort of back and forth between, there's a lot of really exciting work going on right now by many different kinds of people around these classical works, and at the same time, you know, with the contemporary core example that I gave, we do want to, you know, expand and bring new voices into the conversation with the syllabus and not just in the way that we teach the works.
I would add to that is my mic on? Great. How about now? Great. I would add to that, it's among the most pressing questions that we're asking right now. So I think just leaving some space for the gravity of the question, the import of the question, and to know that we can't answer it on the stage, and we probably can't answer it in one turn as chair of each of these courses, but it is, I would say, the single top priority as we think about the next 100 years of the core. Just a snippet of where this might go. Monet has been on the syllabus of art humanities for a long time, and I've always enjoyed teaching Monet. We can do better, though, and some version of that Monet unit may, and I have to, since I don't think I can speak off the record in this context, I have to use the conjunctive, may change to be a unit on Monet, Manet, Cassatt, and Morisot, and would then juxtapose the natural vision of Monet, this idea of direct human vision, and the very deeply culturally inflected vision of Manet, Cassatt, and Morisot, that could only see the world through questions of race and gender, and above all, class at that historical moment, but actually gender equally. So suddenly we have a work like Manet's Olympia, among the most famous images of modern art. It's a painting of a prostitute, and painted in 1863, and since then, so 150 years almost, art history has been almost completely blind to the second figure in that painting. There are two figures, one of whom has produced reams and reams and reams of exhibitions and texts and catalogs and books and essays, one of whom has garnered almost no attention. Because in addition to the white prostitute, there's a black slave. No one even saw her. And recently, a graduate of the Columbia University Art History Department wrote a dissertation excavating her history and put on an exhibition at the Wallach Art Gallery, and then still perhaps, or just closed in Paris, at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and excavated a history of this woman who turns out to be a real woman who's depicted multiple times by Manet, and marks, and this is among the astonishing things that we can interrogate in a new art humanities, it's no longer some Orientalist fantasy of what dark people look like. It's an image of a specific woman who belongs to a post-slavery, so France abolishes slavery in 1849, a post-slavery exilic community in Paris with a whole set of networks, depicted it by a whole range of painters, marking no longer some type of strange Orientalist fantasy created by the West, but a citizen of a new West that would be multiracial, multi-class, etc. So this is happening visually. It's been right there in front of our eyes, but we haven't even paid attention. What's more is, that is the example, going back to the Olympia, she is the example of what the French in the late 19th century, and Americans in the late 19th century, would call the public woman. Incredibly, the term public woman is a euphemism for a prostitute. So the public woman is represented well in art humanities in its traditional syllabus. What we don't have is the private woman, a woman who's not simply the object of the male gaze, who's functioning in a different sphere, often domestic, but not only, sometimes with children, but not only, sometimes in the company of other women. None of that exists in the current Art Hum curriculum. Cassatt and Morisot are masters of those representations and depictions. And in the next iteration of Art Humanities, we will look at a wider range of artists and artworks and be able to ask a wider range of questions to speak to a wider range of human experience.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
This question is for Johanna Skolnick.
Could you hold your microphone a little closer, sir?
Okay.
Thank you.
As I recall, the core curriculum had its origin in an attempt to study the causes of World War I. Is that correct?
You're saying the core curriculum?
Yes.
I didn't understand.
Yeah. That it was a response to World War I? Is that,
Yes.
Is that what you're asking? Yeah, Emmanuelle can speak more. That was CC, was the original, Contemporary Civilization was
Yes.
the original course that was started in 1919, whereas Lit Hum came later. So I don't know if you want to say more about that, Emmanuelle.
Yes, so the CC started in 1919. It actually morphed from a class on issues of war that became issues of peace, right? And so it became very quickly contemporary civilization, and it had to do, I think, very importantly for us today, right, with the reckoning with the kind of disaster of civilization. Civilization was in shambles in the trenches of France and Germany, right? So the idea was, that's what happened to civilization. Here at Columbia, we can rebuild it. And, we have another 100 years of that work to do.
Did whoever was in charge of the CC program bring about a comprehensive study of the causes of World War I? As I recall, much of the cause came about because of conflicts in the Balkans. Was that ever the subject of a comprehensive study?
So we encounter World War I actually through Du Bois. We read this through W.E.B. Du Bois. We read The Souls of Black Folk, and then we read a text called The Souls of White Folk. And it's really a text that tries to understand how imperialism in Europe and beyond Europe had led to World War I. And so it's a very strong critique of imperialism and its deleterious effects.
I wanted to mention in response to this that our rare book and manuscript library and Butler Library will be putting on an exhibition in the spring of 100 years of the core, and you can see things like the artifact of an original 1919 syllabus for contemporary civilization, as well as other materials that show sort of the inspiration for contemporary civilization, the evolution of different courses. So I hope you will all come in the spring and look at that exhibition as part of a question like that one. So I mentioned earlier that the core chairs are a source of inspiration to their colleagues. I hope they've been an inspiration to you today as well, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them very much. And I'll just ask that the panel stay seated, and I'll invite Dean Valentini back to the stage to offer some closing remarks. Hello, Dean Valentini.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. I'd like to acknowledge all our panelists, the panelists in our panel to here, but also those who in the panel earlier this morning who have helped us launch this year of celebration of the core. Thanks to each of you about speaking about how the core has been much more than a curriculum, but really is a guide along the journey through Columbia College and through life. I want to give special thanks to our skilled moderators, Claire Shipman earlier today and Lisa Hollibaugh, to President Bollinger, and to our trustee co-chairs, Jonathan Levine and Lisa Carnoy, who opened up our session this morning. Though we've concluded our formal program, I invite you to continue a walk through the 100 years of the core by visiting the student-created exhibit in the faculty room, which is just behind the curtains here. This exhibit features various historical images, texts, and works of art around a theme of the core born revising itself. Please visit the Core Stories storytelling booth, also in the faculty room, to become part of the lasting record of this celebration. And finally, please take advantage of the opportunity to take a selfie in front of the Parthenon or in the School of Athens, or have a truly immersive art experience using virtual reality that is available in the faculty room. However you choose to celebrate, remember this is just the beginning of our opportunity to consider many important questions about the past, the present, and the future of the core. We look forward to seeing you all at many programs and events throughout a year that will continue to help us collectively support the future of the core curriculum. Thank you very much.